Hey everybody, welcome back to our video. I know it's been a while since I posted a book review, but today I want to talk about The Anxious Generation, how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. I know a lot of people are talking about this book recently. I haven't read too many of the reviews about this book, so I don't really know what other people's opinions are on this book, but I just finished reading it. I'm going to share my opinions, my analysis of what I took away from this book. So let's dive right into it and talk about it. So this book focuses obviously on this concept of the great rewiring, which occurred roughly between the years 2010 and 2015. And at a high level, what this is basically a transition from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And at the same time, children were affected by this exaggerated fear of physical dangers in the world. A lot of parents started becoming overprotective, keeping their kids inside. Aren't a lot of kids just going out, running around their neighborhood, playing in the woods, just exploring on their own. There's just a fear of people in society who want to harm people. And a lot of this fear is over-exaggerated due to, increased media attention and focus on bad things happening in the world. And these two things, this transition to being on a phone, being on social media, and an exaggerated fear of the outside world has led to a lot of social and sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, anxiety, and addiction. And this all happened very, very quickly. And a lot of these platforms that are leading to this epidemic of mental illness, they're aware of how addictive their products are. They're aware of what their products are doing to children and young people. And this author compares it to things like tobacco and vaping, where these companies are pushing a product on people, very much aware how much it's going to harm them. Or things like when they had leaded gasoline, they were aware that this lead was being put into the environment and giving people lead poisoning, but they continued to put lead in gas because it made the gas more efficient and it saved these companies a small amount of money. So you see this time and time again. Companies don't care about people. They just want to make profit. They just want to have as many people use their product as they can. And social media is no different than that. And this transition from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood happens so quickly that we really don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. But in very short-term effects, we can see immediate damage to children. And this author compares the effects on social media and smartphones on people to putting people on Mars. If we one day put humans on Mars, people are living on Mars long term, we don't know what the long term effects are on bones and muscle and cardiovascular systems. Like, we don't know the long term effects of someone living on Mars for years and years and years. And we also don't know the long term effects of social media on children. So we're putting a whole generation into this world addicted to screens, not really knowing what the long-term implications of that are going to be on mental health. And very quickly we can see that there is an epidemic of mental illness. So obviously this is going to have effects for decades and decades and decades to come. And the first smartphone that came out, the iPhone, came out in 2007. And this author talks about how after the iPhone came out, there really wasn't that much change in mental health of young people. There wasn't this sudden increase in anxiety and depression. But what suddenly did change that was front-facing phones on cameras. That happened in 2010, the first smartphone to have a camera in the front to take a selfie of yourself. And that came out the same year that Instagram came out, in 2010. So at the same time, people were suddenly focusing on themselves and comparing themselves to other people. And that's the point where social media really started to take off and just became very invasive in society. People were just constantly on their phone checking for notifications. And this was really the first time that people had constant access to the internet and computers. Because before, computers were just on a desk in your house. You had to physically walk to it and use it and log off and walk away, and that was it. But with smartphones, you constantly have the internet in your pocket. You constantly have access to social media. You constantly are able to compare yourselves to others and be compared to others and just be in this environment that it's just not healthy to be in. You really can't unplug from the internet anymore. And a lot of people claim that, it's not necessarily the internet or social media that makes people anxious. It's the world that we live in, and we're just seeing the effects of that on children now. But that's really not the case, because this often talks about how throughout history you see that the main cause of anxiety and depression is isolation and loneliness. Because there's been times in the world it's been very chaotic, like during the Great Depression or during World War II, and there really wasn't this increase in anxiety and depression during this time period. There was actually the opposite effect. So when there's big generational trauma, it doesn't really cause anxiety. It's when there's isolation and loneliness. And with everyone being on their screens and not going outside anymore, people are incredibly isolated and lonely. And this book talks about how so many children today don't have that many friends. Like, they're lucky to have, one friend, and they're just constantly inside and glued to the phone and just being very cut off from the rest of the world. And it's very important for kids to have this unsupervised real world free play where they can go out in the world and explore and take risks and be exposed to stressors and just understand how the world works. And when you're just glued to a screen inside, you're not really interacting with the world and learning how the world works and learning what it's like to interact with other people. And social media is basically the opposite of free play. It's just very controlled, sterile environment where you don't take risks and you don't really learn anything new besides just staring at a screen. He talks about how all throughout human history you see people engaging in synchronous ritual-like activities, from when we were hunter-gatherers to living in tribes and villages, and all the way up until very recently, people tended to engage in ritual-like activity, from singing songs, playing games, and in my opinion, even watching TV with your family, all together in the living room, was a very ritual-based, synchronous activity. Even though it was looking at a screen, even into the 1990s and early 2000s, people were still engaging in television together as a family. And you just don't see things like that anymore. You don't see kids playing hopscotch outside together, singing songs, playing board games. Like, these are things that were very much ritual activities, and you don't see any of that anymore, because social media is really the opposite of synchronous activity. It's asynchronous activity, because synchronous activity, ritual activities, are things that are done with other people together, and kids are just alone on their phones in their rooms, scrolling through social media and Instagram Reels and not really interacting with other people. I mean, they're obviously communicating with people, but they're not interacting in person, engaging in physical ritual-based activities together. And that's just something that hasn't been the case at all, going back to when humans were still hunter-gatherers. And on top of that, this overprotection that we're seeing today, it's forcing people to be inside more. They're not out exploring the world, not out taking risks and meeting people and learning how to interact with society. So they're forced to be inside. And when you're inside so much, you're going to be glued to your screen more and not engaging in ritual-based activity. And with looking at rituals, we see the concept of conformity. Conformity is a very natural, healthy thing to do. There's a survival instinct to want to conform to the society that you live in. So it's very natural to conform. And in the real world, conforming to a culture or society takes many, many weeks. It takes a long time to understand the people that you're with, understand how to communicate with them, how to interact with them properly. And that takes a great deal of time, because there's only so much information you can take in a period of time, interacting with people, talking to people. But with social media, this conformity happens within hours, because you're just bombarded with so much information. The information that you're bombarded with in just a couple hours is the same amount of information that you would take in within weeks and weeks of communicating with people out in a new community that you're part of. So we're just taking in so much information so quickly that our brains as humans aren't meant to handle that much information. So really, we're just in this environment of information overload, and children aren't supposed to be in an environment like that. Humans just aren't built for this world of constant bombardment with information that we get on social media and get with smartphones with us all the time, constantly being connected to the internet. We're just, and with things like the news and now with AI that's synthesizing so much information. Like, we're just being bombarded with information 24/7, and we've just never lived in a world like that before up until fairly recently. And we saw things like this before. I mean, when the printing press came out, people were very much fearful of how the printing press would change society. People thought people couldn't deal with having this mass distribution of paper information throughout a town or throughout a region or a society. And I think a lot of those fears obviously were overhyped. They didn't destroy civilization. I mean, the printing press changed civilization. A lot of the world we're in today began with the printing press. But I think social media is really the end point of all that. Like, information has just increased more and more and more since the printing press. So now we're just being bombarded with more information than our brains can possibly process. So it's been this process that we've been coming to this point for quite a while, and now we're here. And it's just not an environment that we're designed for. And I think this is really the main risk with social media. We're just not meant to live in this world. And I think a lot of people today, I know people who have young children, and a lot of them, they have their children on social media very young, but their main thought is, oh, I know who they're talking to. They're not talking to strangers. But that's really an old way of looking at things. Obviously, you want to know who your children are talking to on social media, but that's not the real risk anymore. The risk is just being on social media, being exposed to so much information. And the author talks about how the most critical time period of a childhood life where they're forming the understanding of community and culture is ages 9 through 15. That's really when they form an understanding of society, how to interact with society. And the average age for an American to receive their first smartphone is age 11. And with the first smartphone comes access to social media and internet. So right away, right during this critical period of development of understanding of society and our place in it, we're getting this tool that's just disrupting our understanding of ourselves and society and how we should fit in and interact. And it's just having a disastrous effect on children's mental health. And I like how this author, he talks about how there's this concept of discover mode and this concept of defense mode. And humans are meant to live in discover mode. Discover mode's kind of like, humans are a predator species. Not that we're, predators in a bad way, but we're meant to be hunters. We're meant to explore and go out and discover things and just live how a hunter or a predator species should live. And animals that are prey live in defense mode. They're constantly hiding and trying to avoid predators. So we're meant to be in discovery. We're meant to be out going, exploring, and playing and interacting with the world. And with social media, people are put into this defensive mode where they're very isolated and constantly comparing themselves to other people. They're constantly seeing other people and wondering how they compare to that and wondering how other people compare to them. And when you're looking at the world like this, you're just very defensive and you're not living how humans are meant to live their lives. And having this happen at this very critical age is so dangerous. I like this one analogy that the author uses. He uses the analogy of wet cement, where if you try to make a mark in very wet cement, very fresh cement, it doesn't leave an impact. But if you also try to leave a mark in dry cement, it also doesn't leave a mark, because it's dry. You can't make an imprint on it. But there's this very critical time period with cement where if you try to make a mark in it, when it's not too wet and not too dry, the impact will stay there and be left there. So it's very important for children to develop correctly during this time period. And by having social media, it's not happening. It's leaving this impact on them that is going to last forever. And we really don't know what the long-term effects of that are. Another interesting thing he discusses in this book is that how the internet has no real age limit. Anyone can go on the internet and use it. And a lot of sites have things where you have to be 18 years old to enter a site where you just check a box saying you're 18, and anyone can just lie and say they're 18, or they can create a fake user account saying that they're older than they are. But basically, if a child wants to go on the internet and access something, they have the ability to do that. There's nothing really stopping them from going to the internet, doing whatever they want to do. And because the internet has no real age limit anymore, it talks about how our society is lacking a lot of these rites of passages, these lot of milestones that we see throughout our life. And he says how it's important that we should incorporate those things back into our lives, where, it's like the first time a child can go out on their own outside or walk to the store on their own, or, we are able to vote or get a driver's license. I mean, we still have some of these things, but we need to incorporate more of those into our society, because the internet is here, and people are going to be part of the internet the rest of their lives, regardless of how much children should or should not be on the internet. They're going to be on it. And that's really the center of our society. So we need to incorporate some type of milestone or coming of age thing with that, where, at a certain age, a child gets their first phone, and they get their first smartphone, or they get their first computer. And we need to find ways to incorporate that into our society. That's what the author argument that he makes. He talks about how the most critical age range for incorporating these milestones into our lives are ages 6 through 16. And getting back to the idea of addiction, he talks about how there's been experiments that have been done on rats where they give rats this device where they pull a lever and it releases a treat. And they found that even when they take away the treat, the rat will continue to go over to the device and keep pulling the lever just to get the dopamine boost that it gets from thinking it's going to get a treat. And we see this behavior in humans with social media, because humans will constantly go check social media for likes and comments on things just because there's dopamine boost of thinking that there may be something. Or I think the best example is Instagram Reels, where it's just endless scroll where your brain constantly looks for that dopamine boost of a really interesting video. And when you can just endlessly scroll through it, it's just, engineered to be addictive the same way that a rat is addicted to pulling a lever to get a treat. So you see at social media, they're really just turning people into rats in a cage looking for dopamine boosts. And it's kind of scary. And they find that when children go on social media, when they get off social media, like when they go on it, check something, and go back to what they're doing, their focus is completely gone. And it's just destroying children's attention spans, and they really can't focus on one thing for more than a couple minutes at a time. And it's kind of to the point where they get such a dopamine boost from going on social media that they're happy when they're online, but they're sad when they're not online. Just like a drug addict, when they're not on the drug, they have this drop in their mood, and they go through a withdrawal. When you go through a withdrawal, there's a heightened state of anxiety, and children are just getting anxiety from the withdrawal of not being on social media. And it's just this cycle that's really hard to break once a child starts using social media. And what this is kind of getting at is that humans evolved in nature in a certain type of environment that we're meant to thrive in. We're not meant to be looking at screens and having access to all this information at once. And when animals are taken out of their natural environment, things go wrong. They have a lot of stress. And that's kind of what's happening with people. We're being removed from the state we're meant to be in and being thrust into this new environment that we don't know how to interact with. We don't know what the long-term effects of that are. So he goes into a lot of various things throughout this book, but he does at the very end talk about some reforms that are possible. And there's 4 reforms that he mentions. He talks about how children should have no smartphones before high school. They should not have social media before the age of 16. They should have phone-free schools, no access to phones or social media while they're in school. And we should restore a lot of this real-world independence that we saw prior to this great rewiring. And I definitely agree with all the things that he points out. I think these things are all very helpful. But I just don't really think that this is going to happen on a large scale. The internet and technology is just so invasive in society that I think it's just almost impossible to fully root out at this point. It's here to stay, and it's going to cause a lot of damage. And as a millennial, I lived through this transition. I lived in both the analog world and the digital world. I didn't have social media until I was 16, didn't have a cell phone until I was a senior in high school, didn't have a smartphone until I was in college. So I fully lived in both the analog and digital world. I understand what went on during this transition. And I think to an extent, every generation has similar things where, the older generation looks at the younger generation and thinks how much worse they're getting, or, we look back and see how much better we had it back then. And this happens at every generation. But I think that what's happening with social media and smartphones is definitely different. We're entering a digital world that's very different than the past. I mean, this happens every generation, but something is very different. And with things like AI coming out and robotics are potentially going to take off in the near future, we're going to enter this world that's even alien to people who are alive now. Even children who are on smartphones now, social media, I think the world's going to change even more for them. They're going to look at the future and see how worse things are are getting. But in the same sense that I think this is definitely different. This is definitely a bigger rewiring than just a typical generational transition. We've done this before. Humans went from hunter-gatherers to being farmers. That is an extremely intense transition. Those are two very distinct worlds that we changed from, and we survived that. They probably had a lot of similar things going on, a lot of similar anxieties and stresses, but we adapted to that. So humans will obviously adapt to this, even though things are going to be very damaging to a lot of people during this transition. People will definitely transition, because I think this world with the internet and AI is going to be as different as the change from hunter-gathering to farming, and then from our farming world we live in now into this AI social media dominating world. It's that different. That's a whole other conversation we can get into about how AI could potentially completely change our civilization. But I think social media and smartphones are the very start of that, because humans are starting to really, I think, merge with technology, and this is just the very beginnings of that. So this rewiring that he talks about from 2010 to 2015, I think it's still just getting started. We're in the very beginning of this rewiring that's going to happen. But I do believe that things need to change. As a father, I worry about these kind of things. I worry about how my child is going to deal with social media and smartphones and internet. This is something that bothers me, and I see the harm with this on children. But I think as much as things need to change, I don't think society as a whole is going to change. Society as a whole has embraced technology, and it's going to keep moving forward. So I think reforms are possible on a small scale with an individual, because you have to want to change in order to change. Most people don't want to change, but people like me and a lot of other people do want to change and do want to make sure children aren't damaged by social media the way that it's already damaged people. So I think change is definitely possible on a small scale, but looking at the whole society, I really don't think so. I think that this train is already moving, and we're on it, and it's going to keep going. But I think in the same sense that individuals can change but society can't change, I think that people will start to choose environments where they don't have to be in contact with social media, AI, robots, new technology. I think we're going to start to find people creating their own intentional communities away from modern technology. In the same ways that people like the Amish live without a lot of modern technology, in their very closed communities. I think you're going to see a lot of similar things start to happen with just other groups of people. People are going to want to live in a world away from AI and social media, but instead of with the Amish trying to recreate a lifestyle from the 1700s, people are going to try to recreate the 1990s. So I think you're going to see a lot of similar things happen. I think groups like the Amish were probably the very start of that. A lot of groups of people saw technology changing and didn't want to be part of that. I think that it's very different from what we're talking about with social media, looking at, Amish people. There's a lot of religious, aspects of that. But I think just in general, people are going to want to live in communities outside of being connected to this world of modern technology. So I think where we will see change will be in very small intentional communities where people structure their environment and their society without new technology. And you see time and time again throughout history, there's always return to nature movements. And I think with social media, we're going to see it cause so much damage to people that people are going to have this, return to nature moment where instead of returning to nature, you're going to return to the 1990s. Just return to a time period before this great rewiring where technology has become such a dominant aspect of our lives. But anyway, that's my opinion, my take on all that. But yeah, definitely a great book, eye-opening. it definitely, I think, changes the way that you see the world. I definitely would recommend this book to anyone. I think it just kind of shows you how invasive social media and technology is. You don't really think about how much we use social media. I mean, with children today, they're using it and at this very critical time period of their development. But people like me, millennials, we started using it after this critical period of development. So it doesn't really affect us negatively the way it's affecting children today. I mean, it definitely does affect people. There's people my age who are definitely addicted to their phones, addicted to social media. But I think reading this book as a millennial, I think I definitely have a perspective that makes it hit home a little harder for me, because I watched this transition happen. I've watched children become addicted to social media and smartphones in ways that my generation was not. So it's just a very eye-opening book. And anyone, I think, who has a child, is a parent, would definitely want to read this, just to kind of brace yourself for the world you have to prepare for, the world you're going to have to raise a child in. But anyway, that's it. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.